I think it's really important that we have this symposium today. It's really important to deconstruct it and let's analyse English language proficiency as a really key ingredient.
The recent moves by standards agencies to introduce threshold standards, including for English language proficiency, involving not just international students but all students, is likely to be a game changer.
5 years on from the landmark National Symposium in 2007, we examine the challenges facing education institutions in ensuring that international students have the English language competence to succeed in their studies and to successfully transition into employment. The 2013 Symposium brought together 140 representatives from universities, vet institutes, schools and English language colleges, student organisations, standards agencies, professional bodies and employer groups.
I think in 2007 we were worried about English proficiency entering into further education, but now the focus is on how do we enhance the students' English while they're undertaking a degree or other programs, and then the outcomes.
We're not talking about the same industry as we were 5 years ago. We're not talking about the same sort of numbers of international students. We're certainly not talking about the same student compositions in receiving institutions.
Symposium participants examined the current research evidence, including 3 specially commissioned research papers, to critically assess how far we've come since 2007 and to determine the best way forward to improve the English language competence of international students in Australia.
How do we get traction from academic staff? How do we get traction from course coordinators? How do we get traction, which is the interest of our paper, from people who are actually allowing students to come through with the varied and multiple pathway patterns? Currently, is that it's not simply English language tests that are the entry point for international students. The students enter through a variety of pathways. So the test has not become the default position, if you like, for students' entry into university or into other programs. What are we preparing them for when they leave the courses that we're teaching them, and therefore what skills and abilities are we needing to make sure, or to have some way of knowing that there's a threshold standard that they have met upon entry is becoming very important.
One of the tasks is clearly to work more closely together to get good research that crosses the sectoral boundaries. We don't want to go away from the room and knowing a lot but not actually thinking about the practical implications.
We can no longer really afford to not take some interest or some inclusion into what some of the mainstream ideas are that are being developed in universities for taking care of students, looking at the first year experience, developing intervention programs and supporting students in their learning. And I think that area is an area that we really need to be involved in a lot more.
I've heard a number of people ask, well, why should we assess students' language post-entry when they've already demonstrated competence? Second concept refers to the move away from a belief in remedial approaches to language development and student support as well, the idea that we can send them off somewhere to get fixed. The first and primary issue is, if we recognise that language is developmental, how could we best position language development as a core component of teaching and learning? Remedial approaches see the individual as inadequate and in need of support. But as higher education has attracted more and more diverse groups of students, there has been a shift in perspective. How can we facilitate the language development of all students while acknowledging diversity? Language development is linked to many other aspects of students' lives, and within a higher education institution, the activities undertaken under the auspices of any one of these things seems to impact quite substantially on the others.
So the first critical issue is defining the construct. The second one was operationalizing English language proficiency. English language needs to be explicit, but it needs to be integrated. The third critical issue was engaging stakeholders, and here I'm talking about internal stakeholders in particular, policymakers, academics, students. Issue 4 is improving the transition to work. It's clear from the research that soft skills, including communication skills and English language proficiency, are important to employers. We need to make career education more integral and to start it earlier. Fifth critical issue is looking forward. What do we hope to have achieved in 5 years' time? And what about a research agenda? We need to investigate the validity of standardized English language tests for exit purposes. It occurs to me that a lot of the research that we do surrounding international students treats them as a very homogeneous group. The fact that they are not native speakers seems to be their key point of difference. But actually, there's much more. We need to take a much more nuanced approach, I think, when we do research into international students.
The first one was about the reliability and validity of entry standards and entry channels. The second one was about embedding English language within the curriculum, within disciplines, and the issues of resourcing and training. And the third one was issues of exit standards and perceptions around exit standards.
What we looked at was developing a framework for institutions to assess their own English language pathways so they can review them, recalibrate them, ensure that they are able to identify high-performing pathways or high-performing English language requirements, and to be able to benchmark those performances, but also to identify pathways or English language requirements where students have a pattern of being at risk.
Firstly, we had written down guidance from TEXA, but then that was crossed out and it says mandating from TEXA. So there was a real kind of agreement that lots of people are doing stuff on the ground, but it needs the real tops-down imperative.
There needs to be more research on the employer perceptions on the work readiness of our graduates, and that English language acquisition is only one part of work readiness.
How can we ensure English language proficiency is appropriately described in the threshold standards, because that will have a large impact on everybody?
It's important to recognise that particularly these days, our students are probably motivated by graduate employment outcomes. They're looking for the job rather than the piece of paper at the end.
There's been a lot of talk about the need for long-term tracking of students. A lot of institutions have done some tracking of their own students.
We also decided that as a country, this needed to be in some sense a government responsibility to take a policy initiative in terms of driving an agenda for Australia to be a linguistically competent nation. And that there was a really key role for peak bodies in that to drive a government agenda, and again taking the utmost top-down approach to really come at this as a country priority as well as an industry priority as well as an institutional priority.
I think we've had our attention focused on English language for quite a few years now. And it's very clear to me from the day that we've come a long way in the past 5 years, but we still have a long way to go.
One of the things we've got stuck with in the past, I think, is really focusing on definitional matters. And in a sense, the academic world encourages that, because it encourages an academic conversation about this definition and whether it's appropriate for this context and whether we should be thinking more about putting in a different word here or a different word there.
So what can we do as institutions? Well, we need to encourage students to get involved in extracurricular activities and to engage in the community from the outset.
International students, they have to play the biggest role here, because it's not only what's going on inside the classes, but they have to go out, communicate with the people outside, with native speakers, because it's not only write and read and you're going to speak the language.
Coming out of today, I'd like to see a move towards agreement on metrics for the pathways or the channels in particular. I'd like to see a framework to capture activities that are currently taking place.
Now, not only are we embedding communication skills in discipline-specific subjects, but we are also embedding support for those students that are at risk.
I believe that we are seeing a new era dawning in international education. Now international students are much more visible because they're staying on with post-study work rights, they're taking multiple degrees, and they're participating in industry internships. Entry levels, whether we're talking about IELTS or ATA, become increasingly irrelevant. This is a good thing because the removal of the emphasis on entry helps create language as an issue squarely in the teaching and learning portfolio. It makes the embedding of discipline-specific language skills essential for a university to be attractive for international students. I leave then for you to ponder the implications this new era will have upon English language proficiency initiatives. Thank you.